All right. So you heard from me earlier that we have some of the largest social issues and movements and representation here today. I'm going to be sitting down with two of those leaders who are behind, especially digitally organizing and recruiting young Americans to be involved not only in the Green New Deal, but also in keeping families together, some of that biggest campaign on immigration right now. The first person I want to introduce is Arcely Jimenez Hudes. Come on out, Arcely. Thank you. Arcely is actually with the Sunrise Movement. Have you heard of the Green New Deal? All right. We had some fans in here, maybe. All right, my next one is Jess Morales-Rocado. Jess, come on out. Jess is with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, as well as behind the Families Belong Together campaign. Now, Jess, actually, I think some people may know you in a different way. How so?
Yep. Okay, so I have the esteemed honor to be the person that sent Hillary Clinton's text messages in 2016. So if you got a lot of text message from somebody who said, "Hey, it's Jess," that was me, and I'm not sorry. Not sorry.
How many times do people say to you, "Are you that Jess?"
It's less now, right? I mean, 2016 through early 2017, literally every time I met a person. And you know, we use text a lot. It was a really important part of our program, which means I text a lot of people very often. So they would also tell me things like, "You text me more than my boyfriend does." You know, like, I like woke up to your text. So I'm a little sorry for that part, but I wasn't sorry for sending them.
All right, so tell me about your current work right now, obviously in immigration, Keep Families Together.
Yeah, I'm the co-chair of Families Belong Together. We are the people who did the big marches all around the country last summer, or 2018 summer, and the campaign to end family separation and detention. I feel extraordinarily lucky to do this work, and I also wish that we didn't have to do this work. What's happening at the border is a manufactured crisis by the Trump administration because of the zero tolerance policy that they put forward. And that means that they changed our immigration law to criminally prosecute every single person who came to present themselves at the border. That includes children, women, and it also includes people who are presenting themselves legally for asylum. Many, many people who are coming to the border are presenting themselves for asylum.
Got it. Now, Jess, I know that immigration has been something you're working on, but there's also some other issues that you're also behind?
Oh, yes. We do a lot of work at the National Domestic Workers Alliance. So we represent 2.5 million domestic workers. That means nannies, elder care workers, housekeepers who work in people's homes. And one of the reasons that we're involved in Families Belong Together and that we started that is because many of the women that we represent are immigrants. Over 60% of them are immigrants. Many of those women are undocumented. So literally the people who are coming to the border are their family members, their children. We are working very hard to make the lives of domestic workers better, and also to make sure that those women are given the leadership and elevation that they deserve in our communities, because they really are the backbone of our economy.
Got it. Arcely, so they told me 22 years old, the digital organizer getting all young Americans involved in the Sunrise Movement. How did you get even into that role? How did that happen?
Yeah, totally. It's true. I am 22. So I grew up in Brooklyn in Sunset Park. And so, for those of you who don't know, Sunset Park is a predominantly immigrant, Hispanic, mostly working class community on Brooklyn's waterfront. And so growing up, I kind of saw firsthand the intersection between racial and economic inequality and the climate crisis. And I had so much anger inside of me, but I didn't know where to direct it until about a year and a half ago, when I was actually canvassed off the street by someone who was volunteering full-time for Sunrise. And I learned that there was a movement of young people working to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process. And I myself became a full-time volunteer because I was so inspired by the stories I heard of young people all across the country, dropping out of school or delaying going to college, or delaying getting a full-time job to be full-time volunteers for this movement that eventually launched the Green New Deal. So I like to think I made the right choice by joining. So I before like joining Sunrise, I had some background in like student journalism, but yeah, the way I fell into this role is that really I found a community that trusted me and trusted that by virtue of my own lived experience, I was a leader. And I think that that's a really key thing to know about Sunrise Movement is that like we don't put a lot of emphasis or like put a lot of stock in like what degree do you have, what jobs have you had. It's like, are you willing to go all in on this work? If so, then we want you.
So there's a lot of people that define the Green New Deal in many different ways, sometimes depending on what side you are. How would you, for nobody that knows nothing about it, has been living underneath a rock for a little bit, no climate strike, all that other stuff, how do you define the Green New Deal?
Totally, yeah. I always define the Green New Deal as our generation's last chance to secure our survival and the survival for generations to come on this planet. And that means recognizing that the climate crisis we're in is not a result of our individual choices, but it's actually the result of the greed of fossil fuel billionaires and CEOs and executives and corporate lobbyists and corporate PACs who have bought out our democracy for decades and have sowed doubt and division about the climate crisis. And so the Green New Deal is specifically about addressing those big structural those are about addressing structural changes that need to happen if we're actually going to address the climate crisis at the scale that the most recent science reports demand.
Yeah, and when you're going out and organizing, and Jess, this is also to you as well. Why do some people not? When you're out there and talking about the stories or highlighting youth that are a part of it. There's got to be some youth that also don't agree and are not all in it. Somebody will often ask me, hey, I look into your research and I notice there's a lot of potential liberal-style causes and issues if they were to frame it that way. But I heard the arguments, obviously, that the Green New Deal is not. It is a bipartisan potential efforts and so on. But how do you talk to maybe the movable middle or those that are not already in? I'd love to hear your viewpoint, and Jess, same.
Yeah, totally. I can go first. Yeah. So I think a lot of that has to do with, well, a couple of things. First thing is that for decades, I think that we as a country have been told a lie that we just like don't deserve basic human rights, right? Like our economic system, our society is set up to tell us that like we need to pay for basic human rights like healthcare and a home and our water. And so that's one piece, is that for decades people have just been told that we just don't deserve these things when the reality is that actually we do. And then the second thing is that I think that the climate movement of the past, which obviously like incredible work, and we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do today if the groundwork hadn't been laid by the climate movement of the past. But I do think that the mainstream, mostly white climate movement of the past failed to really talk about the crisis holistically. And so, for example, like as we're talking about solutions to the climate crisis, like a Green New Deal, we understand that a Green New Deal actually won't do any good if we don't also have a solution to address immigration and the crisis at the border. A Green New Deal doesn't mean much if we don't have a federal jobs guarantee, if we don't like tie it into decarceration. And so I think like a big project for Sunrise moving forward, and for the entire left social movements moving forward, is to really like expand our issues and making sure that as many people as possible can see themselves reflected in our work and our message.
Jess?
Yeah, I mean, Families Belong Together, like what we are actually trying to do is specifically get to that like movable middle. That's the kind of number one thing that we're doing. If you have been paying attention to the immigrants' rights movement, and you probably have not, which is totally fine, for the last decade, there's an extremely vibrant immigrants' rights movement led by immigrants and undocumented people themselves. I mean, in some ways, if you look at like the Dreamer movement, they have actually like paved the way for many other types of organizing that are happening in this country. So we didn't feel like we needed to organize those people. They're being actually amazingly organized and have made many, many wins, and are incredible leaders. What we felt like is to get what we wanted around immigration, comprehensive immigration reform, or just like not a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment in America, right? Or to end family detention, which is something that's gonna take a lot of work. We actually needed to get more than immigrants activated around this. We needed non-immigrant people to really see themselves as protagonists in this work. And that doesn't mean, and I think sometimes that makes people get squishy because they think it means don't listen to immigrants. It does not mean that. It means still center impacted people and their leadership, and also give allies something very, very meaningful to do. For us, that can sometimes be donations, I think is one of the easiest things, but it's also like, do you want to get supplies? Do you want to volunteer? We've had artists make things, we've had exhibits for the artists have made that have been on the Capitol in Washington, D.C. on the lawn. All of those things we felt like did something that was really important, which is we gave an entryway into the immigrants' rights movement, which is tough because immigration is really complicated. And it can feel really scary to get into something that you don't know a lot about, that you might say the wrong thing about, that also maybe feels like it's controversial. So what we wanted to do is say, you don't have to know everything. If you believe that families belong together, you're welcome here. When you get here, there'll be some stuff for you to do that is meaningful, that makes you feel clear about the impact that you have made. And also, I think this part actually has been really important. As an organizer, I think about my job as being like a motivator for people, about creating motivation over and over again, but also about giving people that first spark that makes you want to do something. That person who made Araceli want to go volunteer full time, that's a really good organizer because that requires a lot of motivation. What we wanted to do with Families Belong Together, and in particular in the face of this crisis where we heard all the time, I feel so helpless, I feel so helpless, I feel so helpless. How are we creating a motivating moment and many, many motivating moments to make you feel like maybe we haven't fixed this yet, and we haven't. We've done some good things, but we haven't fixed it yet. But how do we make you realize that you're not helpless? And to us, that's really important for immigrants' rights, but it's also really important for this moment that we're in our country right now.
Yeah. So there are a lot, you mentioned a little bit of this, that there are some movements in the past, right, that were either led or had their viewpoints on things. Jess, with you, in terms of some of the older movements, what honestly was their first reaction to your work, and then how are you either working with them now or not?
Yeah, Families Belong Together is a coalition of over 200 groups, and I sometimes think I'm like a genius for that, and then also I'm like, you're an idiot for that.
We've all been there.
We're working in coalition in a big, super broad coalition that spans the gamut of people who are like, abolish ICE, and then people who are like, I literally just got here yesterday, and I don't really know anything except I don't believe babies belong in cages, is like, whew, there's a lot of emotional intelligence, I feel, that is involved with that.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that we have relentlessly stuck to with Families Belong Together that has helped is we try to stay around values-based positive messaging. So that's why it's Families Belong Together and not end family detention. Not because we don't want to end family detention, that is the literal goal of our campaign, but because we want people to understand what we are for. And I think that's really hard sometimes because it's easy to know what you're against, and it's a lot harder to talk about something that hasn't happened yet. And the minute that messaging started working, I mean, truly, the minute it started really gaining traction, all around the world, people were like, great, let's change the message.
Yeah. You're like, good, we're successful, we're moving
Totally,
to
and now we can move on to something else, and it's...
And everybody's in charge of marketing.
Correct. And so it has been actually a real struggle to keep people around the Families Belong Together frame, which is also kind of blows my mind. It's this is literally the most successful thing that we've had in a really long time. Why would we change it? But I think that has been a really big thing. The other thing was which I referenced earlier is when we talked about we wanted to engage non-immigrants, people got kind of scared about that because it is true that past movements have said that they were engaging everyone and that has left marginalized communities behind. One amazing thing about working at the National Domestic Workers Alliance is we are the vulnerable communities that many people are talking about, and we're the ones who are leading it. It's all women of color that lead Families Belong Together and that have led Families Belong Together and that founded Families Belong Together. And I think that that's really helpful. I was on another panel like this, and they asked me, why do you think the coalition worked? And I was like, well, there weren't any men. And and we actually do have a number of awesome male leadership now in the coalition, but at the very beginning, it was like 4 women that kind of came together. And I actually do think that was really important because we instilled this idea of collaboration, of holding like many truths at once, of being positive and values focused, of being emotional. Like it's a very emotional campaign. It's really rooted in culture and art, and I think all those things were really helpful in its success and are also like some of the things that make people the most squirmy about it.
Yeah. How did you mentioned some of the older movements in climate. I mean, how did they take it when you came on this? Because you came on in pretty good force. Obviously, you had some backing of certain legislator that was helping launch the Green New Deal. But I mean, how did they take to it, and how are you working with them now?
Totally, yeah. Just to clarify for the audience about the moment that we're talking about is a little less than a year ago.
Feels so long ago.
Yeah, for real. A little less than a year ago. The Democrats, it was a pretty good chance that we were going to win the House, and then an article came out in The Hill that said that Democratic leadership was not going to put climate on the agenda for this session for this Congress, and Sunrise and a lot of other young people across the country were pretty mad about that. So the week after the election, we went down to D.C., sat in at Nancy Pelosi's office, and the newly elected, Congresswoman-elect at the time, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, joined us and put down a resolution for a select committee on the Green New Deal. So part of my work in Sunrise is digital, and at that time I was managing all of our social media accounts, so I was on Twitter all day, and so the reactions were pretty mixed. I think there's definitely a lot of excitement, but I think a lot of the old guard folks saw young people just so radically shift the conversation. And I'll say that it's tough when you've been in this work for probably most of your life, decades. You've been trying to get climate legislation like cap and trade passed, and then it dies, and then you have to wait until you win back governing power, and then a bunch of 18, 20-year-olds come in and slap a 14-page document on the table, and suddenly climate politics in America has changed forever. I can imagine their frustration. But I think Sunrise, our founders did deep study of past social movements, not just the climate movement, but social movements across this country and across the world. And we knew that if we were going to win solutions at the scale of the crisis, we couldn't advocate for piecemeal things or things that were just short of what we needed. We need to actually go big and demand things that were backed up by science. And at that time, about a year ago, it was a few weeks after the most recent UN climate report had come out that told us we had 12 years left to address the climate crisis.
Yeah. So are you working with some of them now? Some of the older guard organizations who have been working on this?
We're in some coalition building, both with organizations and orgs or movements that have been around for a while, and we're also working or hoping to be in coalition with other youth movements that aren't just in the climate movement, but in the immigrants' rights movements, decarceration movements, et cetera.
That are connected. So, we have to get to some questions online because there is a lot coming. So the first one is what happens, how do you maintain interest, awareness, activity when there's not these crisis moments?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked that. This is my number one, I think this is people's number one myth about social movements, that it all stays up on the day where you have 700 rallies. And it just first of all, I would be so tired if every single day I had to keep it all the way up to 700 rally level. That's not possible. But when you study social movements, you learn about kind of peaks and valleys. And what I always think about is how am I creating peaks, and also how am I recognizing when we're in a valley and we need to create a peak. And that is how people's lives work. And so that's how social movements work, because what you're doing is organizing people. for us, that means like, like if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready, And so like you're always trying to create the circumstances so that when your moment comes, you can like really take advantage of it, which is what happened with family separation in the first place. Literally, I was on vacation. It was the first vacation I'd taken in my whole life that was that long. My little sister was graduating from college overseas. I went to go see her. And so it gave me enough perspective to be away that when I looked at Twitter and I was like seeing stuff happen, I called my boss and I was like, look, I don't come back for another week, but you got to organize some rallies like immediately. There's a thing happening around family separation. And if we don't do this now, we're going to miss the moment. And to her credit, she was like, okay. And
Yeah.
that was the first set of actions that we did around family separation. The first week it was 15, and then the next week it was 30, and then the next week it was 80, and then the next week it was 776 around the country and actually the world.
Wow.
So I think that's the other like really important thing is like you build. People feel like, and then hundreds of rallies happened around the country. Like, no.
Yeah.
It's just like not how it happens
Yeah.
at all. And then, I'm really proud to say that since the summer of 2018, when we started doing this work, family separation has never been out of the news. And in fact, we've had multiple sort of humongous media moments. And that has enabled us to make family separation and family detention and being against those things actually at the core of the platforms of all the Democratic Party presidential candidates. We didn't have to call them and say, you should talk about this. They just talked about it on their own. And that stuff didn't just happen. It's because they were responding to what is the pressure that is existing in the world and also what they want to align themselves with so that they can say, these are my values. And to me, that's really important because then there's something happening there that has nothing to do with us. Families Belong Together isn't telling them to do any of that stuff. They're carrying our message for us because it was so resonant.
Yeah. How about you? What urgency? Obviously, you had that big moment we just talked about, but how have you maintained interest, especially given what's going on right now in politics?
Yeah, totally. So Sunrise Movement, like we also orient our base towards direct action and mobilizing people to take direct action, whether it's escalated and people risk arrest or not. And so unfortunately, with the climate crisis getting worse and worse every day, there's actually like moments of the climate crisis every single day. Like there have been like 2 huge wildfires in California in 1 month. There's one raging right now. We've had hurricanes and floods like devastate the Midwest, farms that are still underwater and will probably never recover. And so we've really tried to mobilize and train our base to mobilize around those moments and politicize them. And, we're orienting our movement to an era of mass noncompliance. And, part of our plans for 2020 is to really go hard on the youth climate strikes and to actually, expand them, so it's not just youth, but it's also laborers and, workers joining in strikes. And, making it clear that business as usual cannot go on unless the climate crisis is addressed at the scale that we need. And so, yeah. That's what we're doing. I think just put it perfectly is that you have to build a drumbeat, and the drumbeat has to be building to a vision where millions of people are taking action in the streets consistently. Because when we look back at the history of this country and we look at what we were able to win in the era of the New Deal, FDR didn't just wake up one morning and say, yeah, let's give everyone Social Security. Workers were striking by the tens of thousands across an entire decade. And that's the scale of mobilization and energy that we need to win.
All right, so I have to ask the question about politics because it's the number one right now as well. So let's stay on the topic a little bit. How do you take actual politics, though, out of this conversation? And can you, given what's going on, because there's there's the questions around how do we take politics and partisanship out of these amazing movements?
Yeah, I think that's it's a little bit about audience. So I do want to be clear. Family separation happened because of a Trump administration policy. So it was political before it started. And I think that's really important. At the same time, it's one of the things that we learned during this process, which we knew, but we have lots of data around, is that even among people who align themselves with the opposite of the Trump administration, immigration is not necessarily a motivating issue for them, and their feelings about immigrants may not be positive. So actually, one of the things that really guides us is thinking about as broad an audience as possible. And I think that's actually really important. When we're doing an art exhibit in San Diego because the judge of that, of the San Diego court is deciding whether or not we can add more families to the family separation lawsuit that is helping us reunite families. We're not talking about politics. It's literally an art exhibit we have these really cool like statues of a woman and a child, and we create this entire exhibit around it that is incredibly moving. But we don't really talk about the politics of it, but we can't escape the politics of it when it is a reaction to a political policy and a political movement. But that is why we talk about families belong together and not something else, and also not just the Trump administration, because our campaign is to end family separation and end family detention, and that's going to go beyond one administration or one politician.
Politics out of it? Can you? How?
I think, I guess our approach has been to really look carefully at how we have gotten into this crisis and what the role of government in getting us into this crisis. And the fact is that while the Republican Party elites have definitely been the lead climate deniers for the past few decades, let's be real, the Democratic establishment didn't exactly do much to put them in check. They've also been taking hundreds of thousands, some of them even millions of dollars from the same fossil fuel billionaires, the same CEOs, the same lobbyists, the same PACs. When you take money from the same people, then your interests are the same. And so, that's why Sunrise is going hard on primaries, where we have folks running against those Democrats that have taken that money, folks who are primarying these bought out politicians running on a Green New Deal and showing that a Green New Deal can win.
All right, so staying with you, because this is the next one. Are you ready? Some say the Green New Deal would have a higher chance of success if it prioritized policies that directly would reduce emissions. Pragmatically, why cast the net so wide?
I think that, this actually calls back to, I think, a mistake that the past climate movement made, which was they made the crisis about parts per million and polar bears. This crisis is not about parts per million and polar bears. It's about people. It's about our survival. And folks aren't going to be moved to go to the polls and turn out by the millions to vote for a Green New Deal if they're voting for the survival of some abstract figure. They're going to vote for themselves. They're going to vote for their families. They're going to vote for their father who died of cancer because they were poisoned by a chemical plant that is 30 feet away from their house. That's why people are going to vote.
Okay. Well, let's stay on voting. 2020, what are you working for? I mean, obviously, I conceptually get an idea of what you're working on, but give us a sense of 2020 for you.
Yeah, I think two huge things. One is we want to see as many women of color turn out to vote as ever have in this country. We believe, we believe that's possible. That's so doable. I think we should be more ambitious than that. And two is, I do think we want to see a new president on day one reverse all of the Trump administration's, literally every single one of their immigration policies. If we do not have a president who does that, we will be trying to catch up for probably the next 50 years. So day one, all of them reversed.
2020, Sunrise?
Continue to build the urgency around the climate crisis, and also broadening the vision of the Green New Deal so that as many people as possible can see themselves in that vision of a world that actually gives everyone the right to a good job and a livable future.
Thank you. Thank you both. Let's give them a round of applause. All right.